They came upriver beneath a sky like mildewed vellum, the current thick and slow as if reluctant to bare their hulls. The barges were low-bellied and black, sagging with sacks of grain and pepper from Basel, and on their railings sat the river rats as if taking passage, their bristled backs slick with dew. The boatmen blew horns as they neared the bridge, and the sound trembled like breath over a fevered lip. On the quay St. Nicholas the barges nudged, ropes hissed, and the first man who leapt ashore coughed a dry cough that snapped like a twig. In the belfry of the Munster, the great cathedral, Mathis Zorn kept the city's time with one ear to the wind and the other to the earth. Each morning before the hour of prime he climbed the 100 and some stairs, because stone taught him what men lied about. Stone contained truth in its endurance. It did not flatter or weep. He had come to the habit in his apprenticeship, when the old bellman, Oswald, had walked him up into the cold where the room opened like a wooden ribcage, beams as thick as oxen crossing the air. There Mathis could see the city and hear it, the tanneries bubbling their hide-sour soups along the river, the coopers' hammers clacking like teeth, the morning call from St. Thomas answered by St. Wilfrid, and once long ago, in August, by returning thunder. He listened and he watched. It was early spring of a year that had turned without benediction. On morning mist the flags along the ramparts hung sodden. Men coughed who had not coughed, horses stamped as though their hooves felt the quiver of something unsaid. Since Candlemas the rumors had climbed the river as if they, too, had boats of their own. In Basel, a charnel pit had split open like an overripe plum. In Bern a cloth merchant had shut himself in with his bolts of wool and been found 3 days later with black roses rising along the lines of his ribs. In Strasbourg, no one had died strangely yet, so the councilmen told each other and the guild masters they permitted to hear them. But the barges were moving heavier, and the river rats sat with their whiskers bright. From the belfry Mathis saw the boatman cough, and he saw the way his hand clamped unheard of tight around his own forearm, spilling salt while the other boatmen made jokes about old wine. He watched the foreman Schroeder take the tally and leave, watched the sacks roll onto the quay, and then he listened to the bells speak prime into the air. Stone did not lie. Bells could be made to lie, but it took a strong hand and a harder heart, and Mathis had never owned either. Once the bells were quiet, he descended to the scriptorium where the morning light slid clean across the table. The table was high and narrow, and a board rubbed with linseed until it had a soft shine like an apple. Seated with his quill, he copied what was to be copied, a grant of fishing rights, a deed of sale for a field near the St. Gall Gate, a complaint from the Brotherhood of Bakers that the coopers were using scrap oak that staled bread. He did not need to read the proclamations to know what they were. The words had become tinctures he could smell. In the way vinegar stung a cut, guilt stung the proclamations of the council regarding debts. Mathis, said Claus, the fellow scribe who had once shared bread with him when both were boys and hungry, the guild masters have asked for you. Which masters? Mathis asked. Although he had seen them descend by way of their horses' shadows, he had seen the black cross of the tanners on one breast, and with it the heavy chain of gold that claimed the cauldron belonged as much to him as to his guild. Peter Schwarber and the others, Claus said, eyes looking somewhere else. He always had a look for somewhere else. On a crowded day it would be the mouth of the next girl. On a day like this, Mathis thought, it might be his own hands. They want you to sit with the clerk. The council meets at noon. The old council. Mathis said. The bells had rung prime, noon was hours away. Why so early to prepare papers unless the parchment bore teeth? Claus licked his thumb and rubbed a spot on the table that was not there. The old council meets at noon. The city meets before it. They want to turn them out, Mathis said, tasting the words. They tasted like the rind of a cheese left too long in a cellar where the rats have nests. How many? Enough, Claus said. He smiled without warmth. Mathis, you can bend like willow, yes. Mathis set down his quill. He had a long narrow face like the table where he worked, and at times he thought he might be mistaken for one of the city's laws if he stood upright and silent long enough, plain and rigid and easily split if struck with an axe. Once, a girl had told him he had old hands, not because they were spotted or wrinkled but because they knew what to do without fussing. In their city, a clerk with old hands could be a treasure or a tool. Mathis had worried which he was destined to become. He was not a poor boy from the vineyards anymore, he had a master's chain now, thin and careful, the scale of his ambition measured out like flour. They met in the Kleberstube, the room smelling of glue and chalk and damp wool. The guild masters stood gathered under a painting of St. Lawrence on his grill, and they laughed while looking at him as though they felt too hot. Peter Schwarber's beard was iron gray and neatly clipped. He had once made shoes. Now he made proclamations. He greeted Mathis with phlegm in his throat that might have been a blessing or might have been something else waiting. "We need a new record," Peter said. "A minute of affirmation and a record of overturning." The old council was appointed lawfully, Mathis said before he could stop himself. By privilege of the city in the emperor's name. Peter's eyes did not blink. "So we will refrain from speaking of the emperor and speak instead of the city. The guilds are the city, so the city is the law." Mathis looked at Claus, who had come to stand against the shutters, blocking their sunlight as if to save them the look of their own faces. Outside the shutters, a flock of sparrows argued like wives at a wash. Inside, the guild masters tugged at their collars, at their neckcloths, tugged as though a rope were already there to be loosed. "Write essentially this," Peter said, and dictated as one who had rehearsed. "We, the people of Strasbourg, joined in guild and sworn by our crafts to protect the walls, the bridges, the markets, the churches, and the poor, do say that the old council has not done as they swore. They have kept debt and debtors safe who should have been exposed to the common weal. They have allowed those who poison the wells of our trust to keep their seats." He paused and looked around as if to relish the particular word that followed. He delivered it not unlike a knife from his sleeve. "They have allowed Jews to continue their mischief." In his stomach, Mathis felt the plank of the table jerk from beneath his body and tilt toward a hole. The rumor had come already up the river like a fever, and here in Strasbourg, where the winter had been cold and long enough to preserve meat and malice alike, it became a thing that could become law. Men had whispered poison in the wells when the water turned sweetly rotten in a basin left waiting. "They have done no such thing," Mathis said carefully. "It is said. But it is not established." "It is known," Peter said, and Claus, hearing, kept his eyes on the shutters the way a fox keeps its ears turned to the woods. "The emperor's letter protecting Jews in some cities is not ours to keep if we believe men and their women and their babes die by a kind of craft held by those who will not be baptized. Write it, today at noon we will depose the old council. And on the morrow we shall cleanse the city." There was the truth then, called by another name. Mathis knew Isaac ben Avraham as a man whose hands had more scars than he had sons. He knew old Sarach with her wooden eye that saw further than the one God had left her. He knew them not as the they that met in a guild hall but as the him and the her who sold goose quills of better quality, who added a bag of rosemary to a housewife's basket without charge because in rosemary the poor believed health could be braided like straw. He also knew debt. His father, Ulrich, a vintner by blood and a drunkard by craft, had borrowed more than his vineyard in the Vaucluse could press, debt he had taken from Isaac because Isaac, knowing Ulrich would drink, thought that by keeping the man's house from going to auction he might keep the wife in her kitchen and the boy in his schooling. "Right," Peter said. "Your hand will not be blamed for what is written." "In the eyes of God," Mathis said before he could stop himself again, "hands are hands." Peter smiled then, and it was the smile a pig might make when it finds an acorn, not malice exactly but the satisfaction of hunger sated. "Then God may tell one hand from another," he said. "Write with your better hand." Mathis wrote. The words felt like pig's hooves pressed on his tongue. He was writing what had already been decided. The city had been moving in this direction for weeks. The flagellants had filled the west gate until the street itself beat, their blood speckling the snow like the berries of rowan left in hedges by winter birds. They had set up in the square outside St. Thomas with its plain nave and unadorned sermon, a Lutheran shape in a Catholic world before Luther was yet born. They had cried repentance until babies cried and old women's faces broke like dry apple skin, but Mathis had watched all that and known it to be spectacle. It was this that changed. The guild masters now wanted blood not their own. When he had finished writing, Peter leaned and set his seal. Claus set the council's draft seal next to it, a counterfeit until noon, until it became real. The men nodded and reached for their cloak toggles. The Kleberstube had done its work. The day had a spine now, a place for power to tie its sinew. Mathis stood. "May I go now," he said, "and fetch another quire of parchment? We will need more for what you propose." Peter waved permission, already finding other matters to fix upon, and Claus walked behind Mathis through the hallway, their shoes making a noise like mice. In the passage near the stairs Claus caught Mathis's sleeve. "You could bend like willow," he said again. "I am made of string," Mathis said. "If I bend too much, I snap." Claus looked at him with his somewhere else eyes and, just for a moment, put a hand upon Mathis's shoulder. "It's better for your neck to bend than be bent," he said, and that was the truth as Claus knew it. He would die with his neck uncut. He had a talent for trimming his soul in pieces small enough to swallow. Mathis crossed the square to the little quarter where people called the scents by their proper names. On one side a woman had hung red cloth and rosemary, both in the hope that color and smell might hold away the miasma that came with the rumors. On the other side a man with a mouth too big for his face sold pasties filled with something that might have been pork and might have been his wife's missing cat. The cobbles of the quarter knew Mathis by their edges. He did not hail the men in the doorway of the tavern, he had learned he could never match them in games of dice or strength. He stepped instead into the shadowed entry of Isaac's house, a place built of timber and dependence. Once there had been many houses in this quarter. Now there were fewer. Once the church had allowed Jews to live by the new bridge, then the bishop had moved them near the old. The bishopric's kindness had corners. The quarter had gates that could be shut. Mathis did not think on that when he stepped through the lintel. He had stepped through so often it felt like one more of the doors of his own house. Isaac looked up from the tablet spread on his knees. He had a head as square as the foot of his table and whiskers luxuriant as moss. His wife, Dinah, had hair netted like a fish pond, full of pins. He put down his stylus the way a carpenter puts down an awl. "Mathis," he said, and his voice did the thing that always surprised Mathis, it went from gruff to gentle in a single breath. "Do you come to speak of the spring?" "I come to speak of noon," Mathis said. Dinah's fingers knotted themselves one by one until her hands looked like a cluster of roots. "Noon brings the sun," she said, which was almost a prayer. "Noon burns dampness from the stones." Mathis would not lie to them if he could help it. Here he had eaten poor soup flavored by good grace. Here he had once allowed Isaac to bind the wounds on his palm when an ell of vellum had slipped and cut him, a wound that did the thing a wound does when it is near a tendon and goes deep. Isaac had not teased but had mended. At noon, Mathis said, "The new council will turn the old council out, and they will not keep the bishop's protection for your quarter." "He has come twice," Dinah said, "with a letter saying we are under his hand." "Noon will tear that letter," Mathis said. Isaac nodded. He was not a fool. He had counted up the debts men owed him and seen them like hares in a field alive and racing until a hound opens its mouth. "We will not survive noon, then," he said, as if stating a price made dear by scarcity. "Mathis, do not be a donkey outside a burning barn." "I came to tell you," Mathis said, and he heard the fragile arrogance in it as if from a distance, an arrogance that assumed news, once given, was help. He hated it then. He swallowed and made his next words true. "I came to take your son." Dinah made a sound that had no place in any animal Mathis had ever heard. It was a sound the earth makes when a root is ripped. Isaac did not move. "I can hide him," Mathis said. "I can take him out by St. Gall and make like I am going to the fields. I can take him to the canons at St. Arbogast and they will say nothing. I can bring him back when this is over." "This is never over," Dinah said. "Mathis." Isaac spoke as if to stop the sound his wife had made or the wrath that followed. "I have 9 sons and 4 daughters. Which son will you take with you with your 2 hands, and which will you leave? Choose your child as you choose among the coins you bickered over this last autumn for your father." Mathis winced. But Isaac's mouth softened. "You are a good man," he said. "You are also a man, which is something else." He turned and lifted a bundle that had lain beside the hearth, covered by clean linen. He slit the linen back the way a priest slits a casing to expose relic. The child lay with his bones knit so new that light seemed still inside them. It was the boy they had named Haim, life, because of the cold. "Take him then," Isaac said. "Take him because he is the smallest and Dinah has milk enough for other children. Take him because if he lives he will remember nothing and that will be a mercy. Take him because the saints owe me this little theft after the usury they claim." "I cannot promise," Mathis said, his hands trembling as he lifted the bundle. He expected it to be heavy, as guilt is heavy, as prophecy is heavy, but it was light, frighteningly light. It felt like the weight of a letter that changes the course of a life. "You must not promise," Isaac said. "Promise would be a lie now. Only act." Dinah put her hand to Mathis's cheek and then snatched it back as if she had burned herself. "Go now," she said. The noon that came was not like other noons. It came with the town watch out with halberds and the guildsmen with their chains on, and the poor stood like the freezers of oxen, men who watch a carcass and wait. The old council met in their hall with their statutes and their particular memory of power. One by one, and then in clusters, the men left the hall and found themselves colder outside than in. The new council met and the people in their company gathered to confirm their power by noise. There were words and gestures and the sound of a bell struck lightly to silence them. Then, as if someone had closed the door to a room where men had been arguing, it was done. The burgomaster changed. The alderman changed. Laws that had been laws were now words a clerk had written. Mathis wrote. He did not put his name. He had to, however, put his hand. He pressed his seal, his small clerical bee in wax beside the safeguard that now belonged to these men, and he watched as Peter Schwarber, in a measured voice, spoke of wells and poison and a God whose patience had been tested by Jews. The crowd, hearing the word that gave them the right to their hatred, breathed the way men breathe when released from a binding. Then they moved. Mathis slid along the edges of the square, the bundle under his cloak. He moved not as a brave man moves or as a craven man moves, but as a man with a fragile thing in his arms moves, as a man crossing a slick floor in the dark with a glass vial of medicine that could be wasted entirely with one misstep. He went to St. Gall by the alleys that smelled of fish, by the place where the herb wives had their tables and where no one looked at his face because he was not buying, by the cooper's yard where wood lay stacked like sentences waiting to be spoken. In the yard he heard his name and did not stop. He walked faster. His heart beat in his throat. The heartbeat of the child was not discernible. The child inhaled and exhaled with the small efficiency of one not yet taught by fear. At the gate he spoke to a guard whose eyes were pale as river water. "I am carrying a child whose mother is dead," Mathis said. This time he lied with his whole mouth. "I go to St. Arbogast to ask for milk. The child's life will argue my case." The guard glanced at the bundle and did not try to see in. There had already been a story circulating about well poisoning Jews, now there would be 10 more. One of the 10 would be this one. The guard did not want his eyes to see. He lifted the bar. On the road to St. Arbogast the fields were wet with unsown spring. Here and there the furrows broke into the shape of a boot print because men had walked when the earth was soft. Mathis did not walk in straight lines had been reserved by God for rivers and rays of light. Men pressed their claims on others by making straight roads and calling them Roman. Mathis made his crooked path along the hedges, the child against his chest, his cloak dragging burrs that would take a winter of idleness to remove. At the cannon's outbuilding, a sister in grey picked up the latch after Mathis knocked as if she had been waiting not for him but for a knock and had grown impatient. She had streaks of flour on her sleeve and a small cross twisted so that Christ hung like a man hanged in haste. "Who are you?" she said. "A clerk," Mathis said, and then, because the first truth was not enough, he added the second. "A coward." "A repentant coward?" she asked, a lift in her voice. "A man," he said, "and that would have to do." He held out the bundle. She took the child from him the way a boy might take a pike fish at the river, with caution to the spines and the delicate gills. She peeled back the cloth and looked. She made a small sound, small because she would not grant the world anything more than the small sound. "You will come back for him when the wind changes," she said. "If the wind ever changes," Mathis said. "Wind always changes," she said. "And always returns. You think this new storm is the only weather?" He wanted to ask her name but did not. The fewer names, the safer everyone was. He watched her carry the child to the cow by the fence. A cow named Anne, perhaps, or Agnes, with old eyes like a priest's. The sister knelt, holding a horn cup, coaxing milk and warmth in a single act. The child suckled from the cup's lip with furious ambition. Mathis breathed. He had not known he was holding his breath until then. "What is your name?" she asked, after the cup had tilted 3 times, the child's mouth glossed with milk like a saint's with oil. "Mathis Zorn," he said. To lie again now would be to invite some geometrical justice he did not understand. She made her face blank the way a field looks after it is plowed. "Then I have not heard of you," she said. "Go now, Mathis Zorn. Men will begin their foolishness and need all your ink. Go and ink their foolishness if you cannot prevent it." In the city, foolishness had begun its career. The bell of St. Thomas sang with its dry voice, and the flagellants bled with a rhythm that had become practiced. They beat their backs not to atone for sin, Mathis thought, but because it gave them power they had not felt before. Men, weeping, feel they are watching their own confession, absolving them of the burden of their accomplice silence. The band, led by a man called Brother Marius who had a birthmark that looked like burned leather on his cheek, passed under the window of Mathis's room, singing in a minor key that made one think of an old road and one's mother. The cobbles slicked with a combination of melted snow and blood. They sang and called down curses on those who had not come to join them. They called down curses on monks too fat and priests too haughty. They called down curses on women who made tinctures. They called down curses on Jews. By evening the quarters gate had been blocked with oak. Men had hammered it shut with wedges as if an angry wife had barricaded herself in the kitchen. Torches had been lit to hold off the night, and in the light of those torches Mathis saw his father's face. Ulrich had eyes like stones in a river, eyes that had been worn not smooth but stubborn. He had been good-looking in the way a man can be who knows when to smile and when to put down his fist. Drink had given him a comfort he had not earned and a cruelty he had not known. He had loved Mathis's mother once, and had struck her, and now he spoke in the crowd and the crowd took his voice for an instrument. "It is Jews," Ulrich said, his voice pitched so that the men nearest could hear and the men behind them could opine. "It is Jews, and the burgomaster has declared that he did not know, but now he knows. We are permitted to cleanse our own wells. God desires it." Mathis had never struck his father. That lack had sat inside him like a coal in a stove that burns long and low. Now he did not strike him but stood and watched. Dinah had put down her bread and washed her hands. He thought of her hands. He thought of Isaac's stylus. He thought of the bean counters in their caps. He thought of the child at the monastery with milk warming his insides, and he felt a pang such as he had not felt when he watched his first woman undress. He felt the twitch of consequence. "Ulrich," he said, and his voice was neither thin nor loud. It was the voice a man acquires after years spent in rooms where voices change the prices of things. "You owe Isaac money this spring." Ulrich turned, his beard furry with frost. "Then I owe a dead man," he said, and he laughed, and the men near him laughed, their breath fogging. "Or I owe the church that bought his debts at 50 pfennigs on the mark. Go back to your papers. Would you cancel a debt with fire?" "Yes." He said it as though he were asked whether he would light his hearth to make soup. There are many kinds of betrayal. There is the betrayal that tastes of a cheap wine that you drink anyway and then feel sick. There is the betrayal that tastes of nothing at first and then every taste thereafter is that taste, faintly and forever. There is also the betrayal that is simply saying yes when the soul whispered no. Mathis did not say yes now. He said nothing. He stood and watched while the men with torches set their first piles of straw alight with orderly care. They did not waste wood. They had built wooden houses around the square with cleverness worthy of joiners. They intended to save the walls. They intended to save the women and children. Compromise was their craft. They would gather the Jews on the morrow and burn them not in their own quarter, where the fire might spread, but in a field beside the river. They were, after all, citizens. They knew how to contain disaster. In the night Mathis wrote. He wrote under the eaves in his narrow room above the baker's shop whose oven snored like a laboring man. The writing was not for the new council. It was for him. He wrote what he had seen and what he had heard and what he had done. He wrote because words hold truth like oil holds scent, and because he was a man whose life had made him a vessel for words. He wrote, and then he hid what he had written under the plank he kept loose for saving the coins that would one day build a cottage for a wife he had not chosen yet. He slept badly, and when he woke his sheets smelled of smoke. They gathered the Jews after prime. They allowed men to carry their small mattocks and women to carry their babies.